The sergeant's voice was flat, like he was talking about the weather back home, not this. "All right, listen up. We're moving out to check the tree line beyond the farmhouse, the one with the caved-in roof. Intel says it's quiet, but keep your eyes peeled." Quiet. That word should have been a comfort, but the way he said it, it sounded like a threat. My stomach did this little flip-flop and then just dropped, right down into my boots. This was it. No more drilling in the mud back in England, no more firing at stationary targets. This was the real McCoy. I looked at the faces of the guys who'd been here a while, the replacements who'd come in before me, hoping to see something, anything, a grin, a wink, some sign that it was going to be okay. But they just looked tired. Their eyes were somewhere else, like they were already out there in the dark. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I checked my rifle again. For the 10th time in as many minutes, I worked the bolt, felt the cold, oily metal slide back and forth. My hands felt like they didn't belong to me, all thick and clumsy, like I was wearing gloves 3 sizes too big. The sergeant finished up and lit a cigarette, the match hissing in the damp air. "Saddle up in 5. And just like that, my life was divided into a before and an after. Stepping past our own wire was like crossing into another world. 1 minute you're in the relative safety of the perimeter, the next you're outside of everything you know. The air changed. It was colder, and it carried a smell I'll never forget, a mix of wet earth, rotting wood, and something else underneath it all, something sour and metallic that I later learned was just the smell of the front, of everything broken and left to ruin. The moon was behind clouds, so everything was shades of gray and black. Every shadow between those skeletal trees seemed to shift and move just at the edge of my vision. I was so keyed up, my whole body was like a tightly wound spring. I tried to walk like the guys in front of me, placing my feet down carefully, but I swear I found every single dry twig in Normandy. Every little snap echoed in my ears like a rifle shot. My heart wasn't just beating in my chest. It was pounding a drum solo right inside my head, a deafening thump-thump-thump that drowned out the scuffling sounds of the patrol. I could hear my own breathing, too loud, and I tried to hold it, which just made me dizzier. I was so focused on not making a sound, on not being the greenhorn who got everyone killed, that I almost walked right into the guy in front of me when he stopped suddenly. He just held up a fist, and the whole line froze. We stood there, statues in the dark, listening. I heard the wind in the leaves, the distant crump of an artillery shell miles away, and the blood roaring in my ears. I was convinced the Germans could hear that too. I was sure they could smell the fear coming off me in waves. Then it happened. It wasn't a big bang like in the newsreels. It was a sharp, vicious crack that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. No warning, no shouted challenge, just that sudden, intimate violence. I didn't think. My body took over. I hit the dirt so fast my chin slammed into the mud, and I tasted it gritty and cold and alive with the taste of worms and decay. My rifle was up, but I didn't even know where to aim. The darkness had just spat fire at us. The training, all those hours on the range, it just evaporated. It was gone, replaced by a pure animal fear that flooded my veins with ice. I squeezed the trigger, the M1 bucking against my shoulder, the muzzle flash blinding me for a second. I fired again and again, not aiming, just shooting back at the darkness, at the unseen thing that wanted me dead. All around me the world erupted. Tracers zipped through the trees like angry fireflies, and someone was yelling, "Over there by the wall." But the words didn't make any sense to me. My only thought, the only complete sentence my brain could form, was a desperate, screaming prayer inside my skull. I am not ready for this. I am not ready for this. I fumbled for another clip, my wet, shaking fingers slipping on the release, and I prayed I wouldn't drop it in the mud. The noise was unbelievable, a deafening orchestra of our Garans and their burp guns, the whine of bullets cutting the air too close. It felt like it lasted an hour, but it was probably less than a minute. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The firing tapered off. Someone shouted, "Cease fire, cease fire." And the silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow heavier and more terrifying than the noise. It was a thick, pressing silence, broken only by the ringing in my ears and a low moan from somewhere off to my left. We stayed down for what felt like an eternity, listening. My body was trembling uncontrollably, a combination of adrenaline and sheer cold terror. The sergeant low-crawled down the line, his face a pale smudge in the dark. "Everyone okay? Sound off." One by one, the voices came back, tight and strained. Jenkins, okay. Miller, okay. When it got to me, I had to clear my throat twice before I could croak out, Schultz, okay. Okay. What a joke. I was anything but okay. My legs felt like they were made of jelly when we finally got the order to pull back. Standing up was an act of sheer will. I was certain a sniper was watching me, waiting for me to present a target. We moved back quickly, not running, but walking fast, each of us scanning the darkness, our rifles still at the ready. The walk back to our lines felt 10 times longer than the walk out. Every shadow was an enemy, every rustle in the bushes a threat. I was so focused on the tree line, I almost didn't notice the guy next to me, a lanky kid from Pennsylvania named Donnelly. He nudged me with his elbow and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't a word. But it was a connection. It was a silent message that said, "We made it. This time." And for a single, fleeting second, I felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a feeling of belonging, of being part of this grimy, terrified, but living group of men. But as soon as we stumbled back through the wire, past the sentry who just grunted, "Any trouble?" the feeling vanished, replaced by a deep, profound exhaustion and a shame that burned in my gut. They were talking in low voices, checking their gear, already moving on. But I felt stripped bare. I felt like a fraud, a boy who had just been playing soldier, and I was terrified that at any moment, one of these real soldiers would look at me and see the truth that I was just a scared kid from Milwaukee who wanted nothing more than to be anywhere else in the world but here. I found my foxhole, slid down into the cold, muddy bottom, and leaned my head back against the dirt. I closed my eyes and saw nothing but darkness and muzzle flashes. I knew then that the war had finally, truly begun for me, and that the boy I was when I got on the troop ship was gone, left behind in that field, probably lying face down in the mud. They issued us everything, or at least that's what the quartermaster's ledger said. We got our ammunition, our rations, our entrenching tool, the whole kit. But that was just the stuff they gave you, the official weight. It was the other weight, the stuff you carried in your own pockets, that told the real story. That was the heavy part. A full pack could weigh 60, 70 pounds with all the gear, but I'll tell you, the weight of a single photograph in your breast pocket, right over your heart, was heavier than any bandolier of bullets or potato masher grenade. It was a constant, physical thing, a dull ache that reminded you of what you'd left behind and what you were fighting, or maybe just trying to get back to. For me, it was a picture of my parents and my little sister, Anna, taken on the stoop of our house in Hamburg. The sun was in their eyes, and they were squinting, but they were smiling. I could feel the rough texture of the paper through my tunic, and sometimes, during a lull, when the rain was drumming a steady tattoo on my helmet, I'd take it out. Not to look at it, not always, but just to hold it, to feel that connection to a world where the sun shone and people squinted because of light, not because they were peering over a sight picture waiting for a shadow to move. That little square of paper was heavier than the whole damn war, because it held everything the war was trying to take away. And it wasn't just me. Every man had his anchor. I carried that photo and a smooth, grey stone my sister pressed into my hand the day I left. It was just a river stone, flat and oval, but she said she'd found it on the prettiest day of summer, and it would keep me safe. Superstition. Maybe. But you hold on to anything out here. I'd rubbed that stone with my thumb before we moved out, feeling its cool, worn surface, a tiny piece of solid earth in a world that had turned to liquid mud and chaos. It was a stupid thing, a little rock, but my life could depend on the jam of a bolt or the fog holding for 5 more minutes, so why not a rock? My buddy, Erich, he carried a black bishop from a chess set. Just the one piece, tucked into a little leather pouch. He never said why, not for a long time. We just knew these things were important. We didn't talk about it. Talking about it might break the magic. It was a silent understanding, a brotherhood of little stupid, vital things that connected us to a world that still made sense, a world with rules, where a bishop moved diagonally and a king could be put in check, a world that wasn't just random artillery bursts and the smell of cordite and decay. The letters were another kind of weight. We all wrote letters home, the censored ones, full of "I am fine, the food is adequate, tell Mutty I miss her." But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the letters we never sent. I kept a small, waterproof pouch, the kind meant for matches, and in it I'd fold up the real letters. The ones I wrote by the light of a dying candle in a dugout, the paper shaking in my hand. Letters full of fear so thick I could taste it, copper-like, in the back of my throat. Letters full of doubt, asking what in God's name we were even doing here in this frozen hellscape of Russia, or later, in the dust of France. Things I could never, ever tell my family. Dear Mother, today I saw a man I've shared sausage with for 6 months have his head taken off by a shell fragment. I had to wipe his brains off my face. I haven't slept in 2 days because every time I close my eyes I see it. You don't write that. You can't. So you write it down and you hide it away. It becomes a confession, a diary addressed to no one. And sometimes, just the act of forming the words, of putting that terror onto paper, made the burden feel a little lighter, like you were sharing the load with a silent, understanding piece of paper. Then you'd seal it in the pouch, and it would become another ounce of weight in your pocket, a secret shame, a testament to the man you were becoming, a man you hoped your family would never have to know. After a while, you started collecting things. It wasn't a conscious decision. It just happened. You'd be moving through a village, emptied out before you got there, doors swinging open on broken hinges, and you'd see something. A strange coin on the floor, kicked into a corner. You'd pick it up. It wasn't looting, not really, not like taking a watch or a ring. This was different. It was a marker. A shell casing from your first real firefight, the brass still warm, the air smelling like burnt powder and something else, something sharp and electric. You'd pocket it. These weren't trophies. You weren't proud of what was happening. They were proof. Proof that you had been somewhere, that you had lived through another day when others hadn't. Each one had a story, a memory attached that was yours alone. This coin came from a house where a cat was still sitting on the windowsill, ignoring the whole war. This casing was from the time Werner saved my life by shooting a Russian soldier who had popped up from a haystack 10 feet away. I kept that casing for a long time. I'd run my fingers over the crimped end, feeling the ridge, and I'd remember the bang, the shock on Werner's face, the way he just nodded at me afterwards, his hands trembling. It was a heavy little piece of brass, heavy with memory. The weight in our pockets was the weight of our other lives. The army gave you the tools to die with, but we carried the reasons to live. And it all came down to that one moment, the one that still haunts my dreams. It was after the collapse in the West, the Great Retreat. Chaos. We were scattered, exhausted, a ragged bunch trying to make it back to some semblance of a line. I was captured somewhere in the Ardennes, in a muddy ditch that smelled of rot and wet earth. There was no heroics, just a sudden burst of American fire, the zip and crack of bullets overhead, and the realization that we were surrounded, the fight gone out of us like air from a punctured tire. We threw our weapons down, hands in the air. The fear then was a cold, sick feeling in your gut, because you don't know what's coming next. You hear stories. They marched us for days, a long, shuffling column of gray-green misery towards a temporary holding camp. The Americans looked tired, too. They weren't cruel, just weary, herding us along with sharp gestures and words we didn't understand. You could smell the sweat and fear on all of us, a sour, animal stench. The camp was a sea of mud surrounded by wire. Just acres and acres of churned-up earth, with tents dotted here and there. The rain fell in a steady, miserable drizzle, and the mud clung to your boots each step or effort. We were processed, which meant we were searched, our pockets emptied. This was the moment of truth. The official kit was gone, confiscated. But the real kit, the personal weight, they mostly left alone, unless it was a weapon or something valuable. The American guard, a kid with a face still soft with youth, went through my things. He took my knife, my paybook. He held up the waterproof pouch with my unsent letters. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I just shook my head, a pleading look. He shrugged, a what the hell sort of gesture, and tossed it back into the small pile of my personal effects. He picked up the photograph, looked at it, looked at my dirty, exhausted face, and nodded, almost to himself, before placing it gently back on top. He understood. Maybe he had a photograph of his own, in a breast pocket on the other side of the world. He didn't touch the rock or the shell casing. He just motioned for me to move along. That small act of mercy, that recognition of a shared humanity, was the first crack of light I'd seen in weeks. Days bled into each other in that camp. It was a life of waiting, of hunger, of boredom that was its own special kind of torture. Your mind would play tricks on you. You'd think about home constantly, the memory so vivid you could almost taste the black bread your mother baked, smell the lime trees in bloom. The weight in my pockets was all I had left of that world. I'd sit on the damp ground, my back against a tent pole, and just hold that smooth stone, rubbing it over and over, trying to conjure up the feeling of that summer day Anna gave it to me. It was a prayer without words. We were a sorry lot, a spectrum of defeat. Some men were broken, staring into the distance with vacant eyes. Others clung to discipline, trying to organize what was left. Most of us were just there, existing in a numb state, caught between the horror of what had been and the uncertainty of what was to come. Then, one afternoon, something shifted. A murmur went through the camp. The Americans were bringing in some of their own, a group from a Red Cross shipment, to help organize distribution of what little extra we were getting, some cigarettes, a few books, that kind of thing. We didn't pay it much mind. It was just another event in the monotonous landscape of captivity. They moved through the camp, these civilians, looking uncomfortable and out of place in their clean clothes, their faces full of a pity we resented and craved at the same time. I was sitting with Erich, sharing a cigarette we'd managed to trade for, not talking, just watching the rain make tiny rivers in the mud. And then I saw him. An older man, thin, with spectacles and a kind, tired face, wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather. He was moving slowly through the groups of men, his hands clasped behind his back. There was something familiar about the way he carried himself, a certain tilt of the head. My heart gave a little jump, a stupid, hopeful thing. It couldn't be. The world is not that small, I nudged Erich. Look at that fellow, I whispered. Does he seem familiar to you? Erich squinted, shook his head. Just another Darguda. But as the man came closer, his eyes scanning the faces, gaunt and bearded though they were, it clicked into place. The sharp nose, the way his eyebrows arched. It was Herr Professor Weber, my old literature teacher from the gymnasium. The man who had patiently guided me through Goethe and Schiller, who had opened my eyes to worlds beyond our city, who had once kept me after school to discuss a poem I'd written, telling me I had a feeling for language. That was another lifetime. A lifetime of inkwells and chalk dust, of heated debates about ideas, not survival. What was he doing here? Of all the camps, in all the chaos of Europe, he was here. My throat went tight. I wanted to stand up to call out to him, but a sudden, sharp shame held me down. Look at me, filthy, defeated, a prisoner. I was no longer the bright student with a future. I was a soldier of a lost cause, a number in a compound. I dropped my head, hoping he wouldn't see me. I felt for the stone in my pocket, gripping it tightly, a desperate anchor to a past where I was someone he would have been proud to see. He passed by our group, his eyes glancing over us. I kept my head down, staring at the mud-caked toes of my boots. I could hear his footsteps squelching in the mud, moving away. The moment passed. I felt a bizarre mix of relief and disappointment. But then the footsteps stopped. I risked a glance up. He had turned around. He was standing there about 20 feet away, staring right at me. His head was cocked to the side, his eyes narrowed behind his glasses, not with disapproval, but with intense, puzzled recognition. It was the look you give when you see someone you know out of context, trying to place them. Our eyes met. A long second passed, filled with the distant sound of voices and the patter of rain on canvas. I saw the moment of realization dawn on his face. His expression shifted from puzzlement to a profound, shocking sadness. It wasn't pity. It was deeper than that. It was grief. Grief for what was lost, for what had been done to all of us. He took a few steps towards me, slow, hesitant. I slowly got to my feet, my body aching, feeling every one of my 22 years as if I were an old man. I stood there, in my tattered uniform, a captive in the mud, facing the man who represented the best of the world I had left behind. He stopped a few feet from me. The other prisoners were watching now, silent. Erich was tense beside me. The American guards watched, hands on their rifles, but they didn't intervene. Herr Professor Weber's eyes scanned my face, taking in the dirt, the exhaustion, the hollow look I knew was in my own eyes. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Instead, he did something that shattered me completely. In a voice that was raspy, but which still held the careful, measured tone I remembered from his lectures, he spoke a single line of poetry. It was from Hölderlin, a poem we had studied together. In lieblichen Blau blüht der Metallin Schild. In lovely blue the steel helmet blossoms. The words hung in the damp air. They were so utterly incongruous with our surroundings, with the mud and the wire and the despair. They were a fragment of beauty, of a different Germany, a different way of thinking, spoken into this place of defeat. It was an acknowledgement, a secret handshake from a world we had both once inhabited. He wasn't greeting the soldier, he was recognizing the student. The weight in my pockets felt immense sudden lithe fold. The letters, the rock, the shell casting all of it compressed into this one moment. Tears welled in my eyes, and I made no effort to hide them. None of us had tears left for the big things, for the dead friends, for the lost battles, but this small, unexpected kindness, this thread thrown across the abyss, broke me. I just nodded, unable to speak, my throat closed with an emotion I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness. It was something more like recognition. He nodded back, a slow, sad gesture. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the grey drizzle, leaving me standing there, holding onto a smooth river stone and a line of poetry, the two lightest and heaviest things I now carried. You want to know what it was really like over there? Not the big stuff you see in the newsreels, the parades and the generals pointing at maps. I'll tell you. It was the silence that got to you first. People think war is all noise, all the time. And sure, when the shells are coming in, it's a kind of noise that gets inside your teeth, makes your bones hum. But it's the quiet that wears you down. The waiting. We'd dig in for the night, maybe in some shelled-out house with just one wall standing, or in a foxhole that always had a few inches of cold, muddy water at the bottom, no matter how much you bilaid. The air would be thick with the smell of Itwit wool, cordite, and underneath it all, this sickly-sweet smell of plastered dust and something else. You learn not to think about what that something else was. And then, when the last echo of the last shot had faded away, you'd hear them. Just on the other side of the rubble field, maybe 100, 200 yards away. The Germans. You could hear them talking. Not the words, just the murmur of it, the low rumble of a voice. Sometimes, if the wind was right, you'd hear a laugh. A real human laugh. That was the strangest thing. Or worse, you'd hear one of them singing. A sad, slow song, something from home, I guess. A folk song. His voice would carry across that no-man's-land of shattered bricks and twisted metal, and for a minute he wasn't a kraut, he wasn't the enemy. He was just some poor bastard, stuck in the same cold and the same fear as you, trying to keep his spirits up. We'd be huddled in our hole, shivering, trying to get a damp cigarette to light, and we'd just listen. Me and my buddies, Jimmy from Chicago, a real wise guy, and Frank, a farm boy from Iowa who hardly said a word. We'd listen to that Fritz singing his heart out, and nobody said anything. What was there to say? It made the whole thing feel like a terrible mistake, like if we all just stood up and yelled, enough, we could all go home. But you don't. You just sit there, and you listen, and you feel this weird connection to the very guys you'll be trying to kill at first light. It does something to your head. One morning it was real quiet, a lull. The fog was still clinging to the ground, thick and white, and it deadened all the sound. I was posted in what was left of a bakery. The front window was gone, just a big hole looking out onto a street full of debris. I had a good position behind what was left of the counter. Through a crack in the wall, I had a clear view across the street into the skeleton of another building. And that morning I saw him, clear as I see you now, a German soldier. He couldn't have been more than 18, 19. Blonde hair, a real kid, and he was shaving. He had a little tin cup of water, steaming slightly in the cold air, and he was lathering up his face with a brush. He had a small, broken piece of a mirror propped up on a brick, and he was going at it, real careful, like his mom was gonna inspect him when he was done. He'd make a face, stretch his skin, and run the razor down his cheek. He wasn't a soldier in that moment. He was just a kid trying to feel like a man, trying to hold onto some tiny piece of normal life, trying to feel human. I watched him for maybe a full minute, just mesmerized. I thought about the photos we all carried. I had one of my girl, Betty, tucked right here in my breast pocket. I bet he had one too, some blonde Fraulein smiling up at him from a little leather case. That image, him shaving so carefully with that broken mirror, it stuck with me. It stayed in my head longer than any of the hateful stuff from the posters back home, longer than any speech from an officer, because it was the truth. He wasn't a monster. He was just a kid, same as me, stuck in this nightmare. It's a hell of a thing to see the face of your enemy and recognize yourself. There were these little moments, see, these tiny, unspoken agreements. There was an old stone well, smack in the middle of this ruined village square. It was in a kind of no-man's land, but it was the only source of fresh water for maybe a mile. And by some silent understanding, a truce nobody ever talked about, neither side would shoot a man going to that well. It was like the one rule everybody knew. Thirst was an enemy we all shared. I remember the first time I had to go. My canteen was dry, my throat was like sandpaper. You get so thirsty you dream about glasses of lemonade, ice cold, condensation dripping down the side. Jimmy dared me to make a run for it. "Go on, Mikey, they won't shoot, I don't think." My heart was hammering against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. I climbed out of our position, my rifle slung over my shoulder, and I started walking, not running, walking slowly towards that well. Every step felt like a mile. I could feel a dozen pairs of eyes on me from both sides. I was sure a shot was gonna ring out any second, but it didn't. I got to the well, my hands shaking so bad I could barely work the crank to lower the bucket. The creaking of that old pulley was the loudest sound in the world. I hauled the bucket up, the cold water sloshing, and I filled my canteen. And then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A German soldier was walking towards me from the other side. He had his canteens out too. He was older, had one of those old-fashioned helmets, a sergeant, I think. He stopped about 20 feet away and just waited. I finished filling up, nodded at him, a quick, sharp dip of my chin. He nodded back. No smile, no words, just an understanding. Then I turned and walked back, my back itching, expecting a bullet the whole way. But none came. He got his water and he walked back, and that was that. A tiny, fragile piece just long enough to get a drink of water. You dinard, maybe. That was all. But it meant everything. It meant that underneath the uniforms and the flags we were all just men. But it never lasted. The whistle would blow, or a nervous kid would fire a shot too early, and the spell would break. Just like that. The man you saw getting water, the one you nodded to, he was a target again. Your job was to aim your rifle and kill him before he killed you. And that made the fighting harder. It's easier to shoot at a shape, at a uniform. It's a hell of a lot harder when you know there's a person inside it. When you know he's probably got a photo of his girl in his pocket, that he probably hates the mud and the cold just as much as you do, that he's just as scared. It robs you of the hate you're supposed to feel. It makes every shot feel personal, and not in a good way. You start to wonder, was that the kid I saw shaving? Was that the sergeant at the well? It gets inside your head. The days bled into each other. You lived on nerves and bad coffee and whatever the kitchen could get up to the line. The food was always the same canned stew, hard crackers that you had to dunk in the coffee to soften, sometimes a little fruit cocktail if you were lucky. We'd eat in our holes, the smell of our food mixing with the ever-present stink of the front. We talked about everything but the war. We talked about home, about girls, about what we were gonna do when we got back. Jimmy was always going on about getting a steak dinner, a real one, with a baked potato and everything. Frank, he just wanted to sit on his porch and watch the corn grow. Me, I just wanted to see Betty again, to hold her hand and walk down a street without having to look for snipers. That's all you think about, the small stuff, the normal stuff. You develop a real dark sense of humor, too. It's the only way to stay sane. When a shell lands close and covers you in dirt, you don't scream, you joke that you don't need a blanket tonight. When someone's foxhole gets flooded, you call him Admiral. It sounds crazy, but you have to laugh or you'll cry, and once you start crying out there, it's real hard to stop. The fear is a constant companion. It's a cold knot in your stomach that never really goes away. You smell it on yourself, on the other guys. It's a sour smell. Your hands shake when you're trying to light a cigarette. You jump at every little noise. The worst was the shelling. The incoming mail, we called it. First, you'd hear the distant thump of the gun firing miles away. Then a whistling sound that started soft and got louder and louder, a rising scream that felt like it was tearing the sky in half. You depress yourself into the dirt at the bottom of your hole, praying, promising God anything if he'd just let this one miss. The explosion would hit, a deafening crash that punched the air out of your lungs and shook the ground like an earthquake. Dirt and rocks would rain down on your helmet. And then, silence for a second, before the next one started its whistle. You'd lie there, shaking, feeling more helpless than a baby. That's when you really learned who you were. There's no bravery in a shelling, just terror and a desperate hope to live through the next minute. Then came the day it all went wrong. We got orders to advance, to take a factory complex on the edge of town. Intel said it was lightly defended. Intel was wrong. As usual, the second we moved out of our positions, all hell broke loose. Machine gun fire ripped through the air, that terrible ripping sound, like a giant tearing canvas. Men were going down all around me. You stop seeing them as men, they're just shapes falling. You just keep moving forward, your legs moving on sheer instinct, because going back is just as dangerous as going forward. The noise is unbelievable, the crack of rifles, the boom of grenades, the shouts and screams. I saw Jimmy get hit. He just crumpled, no sound, just folded up. I wanted to stop, but you can't. You have to keep going. We made it to the shell of the factory, fighting from room to room, kicking in doors, tossing grenades ahead of us. It was close quarters, brutal work. The air was thick with dust and smoke, stinging your eyes and choking you. I rounded a corner into a large workshop, the machines silent and rusted, and there he was. A German soldier, maybe 10 feet away, raising his rifle. I fired first. I saw him jerk back and fall. I stood there for a second, breathing hard, my ears ringing. Then I moved forward, my rifle trained on him. He was lying on his back, not moving. He was young. And as I got closer, my blood ran cold. It was him, the kid from the broken mirror, the one I'd seen shaving. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. There was a little foam of blood at the corner of his mouth. His razor was still probably in his pack. I just stared. I felt sick. This wasn't a shape, a uniform. This was the boy with the blonde hair, the one trying to feel human. And I had killed him. I felt a wave of shame and sorrow so heavy it almost buckled my knees. This was the truth of it. This was what it all came down to, not flags or countries, but me in a ruined factory, standing over a boy I'd seen in a moment of peace, and I had ended his life. I took the photo from his pocket. A young girl with braids, smiling. I put it back. There was nothing else to do. We took the factory, but I didn't feel like we'd D1 anything. Not long after that, it was my turn. A sniper's bullet caught me in the leg. It was a burning, tearing pain, and then I was down. The guys got me back to an aid station, and then it was a blur of field hospitals and eventually a ship back home. The war was over for me. I ended up in a POW camp for a while, but that's a story for another day. People welcomed me home as a hero. They slapped me on the back and bought me drinks, but I never felt like a hero. I just felt like a man who got lucky, who managed to crawl out of the mud when a lot of better men didn't. Jimmy didn't. Frank didn't. And that German boy in the factory certainly didn't. The heroes are the ones who stayed there, under little white crosses or in unmarked graves. The rest of us were just the ones who came back, and we carry it with us, every day. You see, war isn't about the big battles and the grand strategies. It's about the silence between the explosions. It's about the nod at a well. It's about the face of a boy shaving in a broken mirror. It's about learning that the enemy is a man just like you, and then having to kill him anyway. That's the unspoken truth of it. That's the truce we all made, not in the ruins, but in our own hearts, just to be able to live with ourselves afterward. And let me tell you, some days, it's a truce that's awful hard to keep. You didn't hear the explosion so much as you felt it, a thump in your chest that was worse than the sound, but you always heard the scream that came after. That high, ragged sound, like something tearing, that was the real starting pistol for my war. Medic! It's a cry that doesn't even sound human after a while. It's a signal, a siren that rewires your whole nervous system. Your feet are moving before your brain even registers the word. A lurch toward the smoke, and the chaos while every other sane soul is ducking or running the other way. Your pack, your aid kit, it all felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds until that moment. And then it was like you were flying, your heart hammering against your ribs, not from fear, not yet, but from this terrible, urgent need to get there, to get to where the bad thing had just happened. You'd run past your buddies, their faces pale and grim, and they'd give you this look, a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them calling for you. And in the back of your mind, a little voice was always whispering, "This time, it might be the one that gets you. This might be the run you don't come back from." And then you'd get there. The triage trench wasn't a real place on any map. It was wherever you dropped to your knees. It was a crater, a ditch, the lee side of a shattered wall, any patch of ground that offered a second's cover. My job, they told me in training, was to save lives. But out there, my job was to be a judge. I had to decide in the space of a few heartbeats, with bullets snapping overhead and dirt kicking up around me, who had a chance and who was already gone. You'd look at a man, really look, and your mind would be racing, calculating. That gut wound, bad. That tourniquet on a leg already pulp, maybe. That grey, waxy look on a face that was too still. That was the worst sign of all. You had to be a doctor and a guard, and I was just a kid from Milwaukee who'd taken a first aid course. The hope in their eyes when they saw you, when they saw the red cross on my arm, that was a weight that crushed you more than any pack. They thought you could fix it. They thought you could make the pain stop, could turn back the clock to before the shell landed. And all you had was a few strips of cloth, a syringe, and a prayer. My tools were simple, brutal things. My kit was bandages, morphine, and a pair of heavy-duty scissors. The morphine was for them, a little taste of heaven in a hellish place, a few precious moments of peace from the grinding, screaming pain. I'd fumble with the little waxed paper tube, break the end off, and jab the needle into their leg or their arm. Their eyes would soften, the terror would recede just a bit, and they'd maybe even murmur a thanks, Doc. The scissors had two purposes. UD used them to cut away the wool uniform, the denim, to get to the wound, to see the damage. But you also used them for something else. You'd use them to cut away the hope. When a man was too far gone, when the breath was rattling in his chest, and there was nothing but a massive, sucking chest wound or his insides were out, you'd take those scissors and you'd cut the strap of his helmet. You'd cut his dog tags from around his neck if you could. A quiet signal to the other guys that this one was for the Graves registration, not for the aid station. The bandages were never, ever enough. You learned to be creative. A belt became a tourniquet. A cleanish piece of a shirt became a compress. You'd use your own hands to put pressure on a wound, feeling the hot, sticky blood pulse against your palm, willing it to stop, staring into the man's face, telling him to hang on, help is coming, even when you knew it wasn't coming fast enough. It's the faces I can't forget. The ones I saved, God bless, I'm glad for them, but their faces have blurred together over the years into a kind of grateful smile. It's the ones I lost that are etched into my memory, sharp and clear as if it happened yesterday. There was this kid, couldn't have been more than 18, fresh-faced, looked like he should have been delivering milk back home. He took some shrapnel in the belly, a real bad one. The smell, you never forget the smell of a gut wound. It's a sweet, coppery, foul smell that gets in your nose and stays there. He was scared, his eyes wide, and he kept calling for his mother. Not in a scream, but in a whisper like he was just in the other room and she couldn't hear him. Mom, it hurts. Mom, can you come? I held his hand. I gave him all the morphine I had left, and I just talked to him. I told him it was going to be okay, that he was brave, that we'd get him home. I lied to him. He faded away looking right at me, but he wasn't seeing me. He was seeing her. And then there was the old-timer, a sergeant who'd been from Africa to Italy, a tough son of a gun with a face like leather. He caught a burst from a machine gun across his chest. He saw me coming, saw me looking at him, and he just shook his head. He pointed a bloody finger toward another guy, a younger kid who was screaming with a leg wound. Him first, Doc, he grunted. I'm done. See to the boy. That was a kind of courage I couldn't even comprehend. He made his own triage decision, gave up his spot, and just laid his head back and stared at the sky until he was gone. Those men, they are all here with me every day. You can patch up a body, stitch the skin, set the bone, but you can't patch up a soul. You can't unsee the moment it just leaves. It's like a light going out behind the eyes, and you're left there in the dark, holding onto a shell that used to be a person. The waiting was almost as bad as the fighting. Those long, cold nights in a foxhole, dug into the dirt with some other poor bastard, sharing a cigarette if you were lucky enough to have one. You'd sit there, listening to the shells whistle overhead, hoping they'd land somewhere else, feeling the ground shake when they did. The mud was a constant enemy. It got into everything: your boots, your food, your rifle. It was cold and thick, and it smelled of decay and cordite. You try to sleep, but you never really slept. You just doze, your mind playing tricks on you, hearing things in the rustle of the wind. You'd think about home, about stupid things. A cold beer, a hot bath, your mom's cooking, a girl you de-kissed before you shipped out. You'd write letters in your head that you knew you might never get to send. And the dark humor, you had to laugh or you'd go crazy. We had this one guy, Mikey from Brooklyn, he was a riot. He could find something funny in the middle of a barrage. Once, after a near miss, he brushed the dirt off his jacket and said, "Well, that was a close shave. Almost got my hair cut for free." It was dumb, but we'd laugh, a raw, desperate kind of laugh that kept the fear at bay for a few seconds. That camaraderie, that was the only thing that made it bearable. These guys weren't just buddies, they were your family. You knew everything about them, how they took their coffee, what their girl looked like, the sound of their snoring. You'd share your last chocolate bar, your last dry pair of socks. You trusted them with your life, literally, every single day. Then the order would come to move out, and the fear would come back, a cold knot in your stomach. You'd check your gear for the 100th time, make sure your bandages were dry, your morphine syrettes were intact. You'd look at the faces of the men in your squad, and you could see the same fear in their eyes. But you'd nod, you'd crack a joke, and you'd start walking, one foot in front of the other, into God knows what. The world would shrink down to the few feet in front of you, to the back of the man ahead of you. You'd hear the crack of rifles, the burp of a machine gun, and you'd hit the dirt, your heart trying to beat its way out of your chest. Your mouth would be so dry you couldn't swallow. And then it would start again. The cry, medic. And you'd be off, running toward the sound, your own safety forgotten, because that was the job. That was the choice I made, over and over again. Not to be a hero, but to be there, to be the one who ran toward the scream when everyone else was running away. It was the most terrible, most important thing I've ever done. And I still hear those screams sometimes, in the quiet of the night. They're a part of me now, just like the mud and the fear and the faces of the men I couldn't save. You want to know about the war? The history books will tell you about the battles, the dates, the generals. They won't tell you about the letters, not the real ones anyway. Everyone wrote letters home. It was our only tether to the world, to the people we used to be. But there were two kinds of letters, the one you mailed and the one you wrote for yourself, the one you burned. This is a story about the second kind. It starts, like most things out here, with a lie. I just finished writing to my mother. It was the usual stuff. Dear Muddy, I am fine. The food is okay. We have good morale. The weather has been wet, but we are managing. I even threw in a line about how the French countryside was beautiful, which I suppose it was, underneath all the craters and the mud and the rusted metal. I signed it, your loving son, Carl, sealed the envelope, and placed it neatly in the crate for outgoing mail. It was a performance, a little play I put on for the folks back home to keep them from worrying. But the performance ends when the curtain closes, and when I put that envelope down, the real work began. I pulled out my personal notebook, the one with the oil-stained cover that I kept tucked inside my tunic, next to my heart, not for sentimentality, but because it was the driest place. This wasn't for my mother. This was for me. This is where the truth lived. This is where I could be scared. I opened it to a fresh page, the paper already damp from the air that clung to everything, and I started to write what I really saw. Not the beautiful countryside, but the mud. God, the mud. It wasn't just dirt and water. It was a living thing, a cold, greedy creature that sucked at your boots with every step, trying to pull you down into the earth. It was the color of slate and shit, and it smelled like decay. When you walked through it, it made a sound like a wet mouth opening and closing. It caked on your uniform, adding 20 pounds of weight, and it got everywhere in your rifle, your food, your ears. You'd wake up in your foxhole with it dried on your face, a cracked, filthy mask, and the tiredness. The history books talk about fatigue, but they don't understand. This wasn't about needing a good night's sleep. This was a grinding, bone-deep exhaustion that became a part of you, like your own skeleton. It was heavier than the mud. Your eyes would feel like they were full of sand, and your body moved on some automatic instinct because your mind was too tired to give it orders anymore. You could sleep for an hour in a shell hole and wake up more tired than when you lay down. Then there was the smell. You never, ever get used to the smell. It's a cocktail you can't forget. Cordite from the shells, that sharp, bitter tang that stays in the back of your throat. Damp wool from our uniforms that never dried. The latrine pits, of course. But underneath it all, when the wind shifted, was the other smell. The sweet, cloying, rotten meat smell of death. It didn't matter if it was a cow or a horse or a man. After a day or two in the sun, it all smelled the same. It would get into your nostrils and live there, a ghost in your sinuses. You'd try to eat your hardtack and sausage, and you'd taste that smell on the food. You'd wake up in the morning, and it would be the first thing you smelled. It was the scent of the front, and it followed you like a shadow. I wrote about the fear. Not the sharp, sudden fear when the artillery starts screaming in. That's pure animal panic. I mean the cold knot of dread that took up permanent residence in your gut. It was always there, a little ball of ice, tightening when things got quiet. That's the thing they never tell you, how loud the silence can be. When the shelling stops and the machine guns go quiet, that's when the fear gets really loud. You're waiting, just waiting, for it to start again. You're listening so hard your ears ache, trying to hear the click of a rifle bolt, the crunch of a boot on gravel, the whisper in a language you don't understand. Your own breathing sounds like a hurricane. Every rustle of a rat in the debris is an enemy soldier crawling towards you. That silence was worse than the noise, because in the noise, at least you knew where the hell death was coming from. I confessed things in that letter that I could never say out loud. I wrote that I was not the hero my mother probably imagined me to be, the brave soldier from the newsreels. The truth was, I was just a kid who was scared shitless most of the time. I wrote about how during a barrage, I didn't stand tall and fire my rifle at the enemy. I pressed my face into the dirt at the bottom of my foxhole, my helmet pulled down as far as it would go, and I prayed. I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. I prayed for the earth to swallow me whole. I'd curl up into a ball, my hands over my head, and I'd whimper like a puppy. The ground would shake with every impact, and dirt and stones would rain down on me, and I'd just lie there, waiting for the one that had my name on it. I admitted that I sometimes wished for a Heimatschus, a wound serious enough to get you sent home, but not enough to kill you or cripple you for life. A nice, clean shot in the arm or the leg. The other guys talked about it too, in hushed tones. $1 million wound, some called it. It was a dark, shameful hope, but it was there. Anything to get away from the constant, grinding terror of the front line for a few weeks, a few months, maybe for good. And then there was the guilt. Oh, the guilt. I wrote about France. France was from my village. We got drafted together, went through basic training together. He was a big, loud guy with a laugh that could make you smile even in this hellhole. He had a picture of his girlfriend, Liesel, that he'd show to anyone who would look. 2 days ago, we were side by side in this very trench. It was raining, as usual. He was telling me some stupid joke about a farmer and a priest, and I was laughing, actually laughing for the first time in weeks. A sniper's bullet doesn't make a loud noise. It's just a sharp crack, and then the sound of the impact. It hit him right in the throat. He didn't even make a sound. He just looked at me with these wide, surprised eyes, and then he crumpled. There was so much blood. It poured out of him onto the mud, and there was nothing I could do. I held his hand while he died, which took maybe a minute but felt like a lifetime. His eyes stayed open, fixed on that grey, indifferent sky. Why him? Why did that bullet find France with his laugh and his picture of Liesel and not me? I was right next to him. I was the one laughing. I survived, and he didn't. There's no sense to it, no reason. It's just blind, stupid luck, and you carry that luck like a curse. You feel guilty for being alive, for eating your lousy meal that night, for seeing another sunrise when your friend won't. You feel guilty for the relief that washes over you when you realize it wasn't you. It's a terrible, selfish feeling, but it's real. I wrote all that down. I poured that guilt onto the page, every bitter drop of it. I wrote about the small things, the details that made it real. The taste of the ersatz coffee, bitter and grainy, that was more chicory than coffee bean. The way your feet would go numb in your boots and you'd be terrified of trench foot, so you'd spend your few minutes of rest trying to massage some feeling back into them. The rats. God, the rats. They were fat and bold, feasting on the unburied dead. They'd run right over you in the night. You'd try to kill them with your shovel, but there were always more. They were part of the landscape. I wrote about the dark humor, the only thing that kept you from going insane. Like when Hoffman found a boot with a foot still in it and said, "Well, at least someone's standing down." It wasn't funny, not really, but we laughed until we cried because it was so grotesque. It was a way of pushing the horror away for a second. We gave names to the enemy artillery guns based on the sound they made. There was one we called Moaning Minnie because of the eerie sound the shells made in flight. You'd hear that moan and you dive for cover. It was all part of the strange, terrible routine. I wrote about the homesickness, a physical ache that was worse than any wound. It wasn't just missing your family or your bed. It was missing the feeling of being safe, of not having to be afraid. I'd close my eyes and try to remember the smell of my mother's apple strudel baking in the oven, the sound of the church bells on a Sunday morning, the feel of clean sheets. I'd think about walking down my street, not looking for snipers or listening for shells, just walking. It felt like a dream of another life, a life that belonged to someone else. I wondered if I would ever get back to that person, or if he was gone forever, buried out here in the mud along with France and so many others. The page filled up with my scrawled handwriting, the pencil getting blunt as I poured everything out. The fear, the filth, the fatigue, the guilt. All the things I had to hide from the officers, from my buddies, even from myself during the day. But on that page, I didn't have to be brave. I could be exactly what I was, a 20-year-old kid who was in way over his head and just wanted to go home. When I finally finished, my hand was cramping, but I felt empty, drained, but also lighter, as if I'd set down a heavy pack I'd been carrying for miles. The words were out of me. They were on the paper, a tangible thing. But that created a new problem. I couldn't keep it. This wasn't a diary to be found if I didn't make it. My mother could never read this. No one could. This was a secret between me and the war. So I had to perform the final ritual, the ritual of letting go. I waited until it was my turn for a few hours of sleep. The dugout was crowded, guys snoring on carts, the air thick with smoke and sweat. But I found a quiet corner near a small, grimy window where a candle stub was guttering. I took out the page I'd written on. I folded it carefully, then folded it again, making a small, thick square of confessions. I held it to the candle flame. For a second, nothing happened, and then a thin line of brown appeared at the edge, curled black, and a tiny flame sprang to life. It was hypnotic, watching my truth catch fire. I held it until the heat started to bite my fingertips. Then I dropped it into an old, empty tin can we used for butts. I watched the flames consume the words. I am afraid turned to ash. The mud sucks at my soul, curled and blackened. I am not a hero, vanished in a brief, bright flare. The paper darkened, the edges glowing orange, and then it collapsed into a fragile black leaf. A wisp of smoke, smelling of burnt paper and all my fears, rose from the can. It drifted up towards the cracked ceiling and disappeared. It was gone. My secret was safe. The smoke had carried it all away, the fear, the shame, the guilt up into the air, away from everyone. A confession only I would ever know. I sat there for a long time, just watching the last embers die in the can, feeling strangely peaceful. The war was still outside. The mud was still there. France was still gone. But for a few minutes the weight was gone. I had told the truth, if only to myself, and that was enough to get me through one more day. That's how you survived. You wrote the letter you could never mail, and then you burned it, and you went back to the business of living, one day at a time. Until maybe, one day, you could finally go home.